Okay, everybody, so here we go with evaluating deductive arguments, which is part of Chapter 1, Section 4. We're going to take that section, Chapter 1.4, in two pieces. So first, we're just going to look at how you evaluate deductive arguments, right? So last week or in the previous lecture, we covered the difference between deduction and induction, right? They're both types of reasoning that are represented in arguments. So if you remember, in a deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, must logically be true. In other words, assuming the premises are true, the conclusion would follow necessarily. The conclusion would have to be true. There's no other logical conclusion you could possibly draw if you assume those premises are true. And the assumption's a critical part. So what I'm going to do here is talk you through some definitions, and then we'll just work some problems together, because I find that's the best way to illustrate how you go about evaluating deductive arguments, which is not easy. It's kind of a hump concept. The difference between validity and soundness isn't always immediately grasped, and it takes work and practice. Okay, let's go. So, when evaluating deductive arguments, we use the terms valid and sound. Okay, so validity refers to the structure or the form or the logic of the argument. And then soundness refers to the truth or falsity of its content. So evaluating arguments, be they deductive or inductive, it's like a two-step evaluation. You check the logic first. If the logic is okay, then you move on to figuring out whether or not the premises are true. So a deductive argument can be said to be valid when, if its premises are true, the conclusion must be true, or the conclusion is said to follow necessarily from the premises, like we said before. And it can be said to be sound when it's valid and has all true premises, which is going to guarantee you a true conclusion. So keep this in mind. There's only three possible ways that a deductive argument can be evaluated. You can only come up with three results. The argument can be both valid and sound, which means it's solid, it's good, top to bottom. It can be valid but unsound, which is going to mean that the logic's good, but there's a problem in one of the premises. Or more of the premises are false. Or it can be invalid, which means the logic's no good, the deductive argument has failed, logically speaking, and that automatically makes it unsound. So it doesn't even matter whether the premises are true or false. If the logic's no good, the whole argument is no good. You just ditch it. So it stands to reason, then, that there's no such thing as an invalid and unsound argument. No such thing. Wait a minute. That's wrong. Take it back. There's no such thing as an invalid but sound argument. Sorry about that, everybody. I'm not going to go back to re-record that. Just cross that out. No such thing. No such thing as an invalid but sound argument. Okay. So here's how you test a deductive argument for validity and soundness. We'll go through the steps, and then we'll just apply this, right? So first, assume that the premises are true, and that means that no matter how objectionable or ridiculous or just outright false the premises may seem to you, just pretend like they're true for a minute, right? Don't take issue with truth and falsity at first. Just go, okay, I'm going to go with this for a minute, right? I'm going to assume the premises are true. And then you determine whether the conclusion would follow necessarily from the assumed truth of those premises. Would that conclusion have to follow? If you assume in other words, if you assume the premises are true, would that conclusion have to be true as well? So if it does, if the conclusion does follow necessarily, the argument's valid. If it doesn't, the argument's invalid. And again, When a deductive argument's invalid, it's automatically unsound, right? If and only if the argument's valid, then examine the truth value of the premises. Are they all in fact true? If so, then the argument is sound as well. But if even one of them's false, you've got an unsound argument. Okay? So again, all this talking has some value, but this really pops when we just work through examples together, which we're about to do. Okay, so all men are mortal. Bradley Cooper is a man. Therefore, Bradley Cooper is mortal, right? So what we do is just pretend this is true. Pretend this is true and that you absolutely know it. You ask yourself first, would this conclusion have to be true as well if those two are true? And the answer is yes, it would have to be the case that Bradley Cooper is mortal if all men are mortal and Bradley Cooper is a man, right? So the argument is valid, right? And then you go back and you check, is that in fact true? Yes. And is that in fact true? Yes. That means it's sound too. So the logic's good, it's valid, and it's sound because the premises and hence the conclusion are true as well. Okay, another one. No dogs are mammals. All Rottweilers are dogs. So no Rottweilers are mammals. So pretend that these are true for a moment, that dogs aren't mammals, no dogs are mammals, and that all Rottweilers are dogs. You ask yourself, if those were true, would that have to be true as well? And the answer is yes, it would. So the argument's valid. And then picture in your head like a green light. That means you have to check for soundness. So, excuse me. Is this true? So check the premises. No dogs are mammals. False. All you need is one false premise to make the argument unsound. So this argument is valid but unsound. The logic's good because the conclusion follows necessarily, but premise one is false. All dogs are actually mammals, right? More. If you are in San Diego County, then you're in California. And you are in San Diego County. Therefore, you're in California, right? Assume it's true, and ask if that conclusion would have to follow. And the answer is yes, it would. So this argument is valid. Then see if these are in fact true. Is it true that if you find yourself in San Diego County, you're going to be in California? That's true. And is it true that you are in San Diego County? For a minute, we're just going to have to pretend that we're all in San Diego County, even if you're out of town. Okay? So let's say this is true as well. That makes the argument sound. So this argument's valid and sound. Logic is good because the conclusion follows necessarily, and premises are true, hence the conclusion is true. Okay? Another that's similar. If you're in San Diego County, then you're in California, and you're not in California, so you must not be in San Diego County. Assume they're true, and ask if the conclusion would follow necessarily. If you assume these both are true, that conclusion would have to follow necessarily. So the argument is valid, right? And that means you move on to soundness. Is this true? Yes. We got to pretend like we're all in California. I typically use these in my in-person classes, right? So it's easy to verify this. Let's pretend like we're all here. And then this says, you are not in California, therefore you're not in San Diego County. So true, false, which makes this argument unsound. So it's valid but unsound. Logic is good because the conclusion follows necessarily, but premise 2 is false because we are in California. Okay. Either we are in the United States or we are in Canada. And we're not in Canada, therefore we must be in the United States. Pretend they're true. Ask if the conclusion would have to be true as well. Answer is yes, this argument is valid, right? If it's either this or this, if it's either X or Y and it's not Y, then it must be X. Valid. Now, is this true? We got to go with this here. Yes, this is true. We are in the US or we're in Canada, unless you are right now doing this in France, for instance. But let's just imagine we're all here. Then we're not in Canada. That's true as well. So since this is valid and both premises are true, it's sound as well. Right? And again, either we're in the US or we're in Canada, and we're not in the US, therefore we must be in Canada. Again, go with it. So pretending that these are true, right? That conclusion must follow. So this argument's valid. And then ask, are the premises in fact true? Yes. This is false. And you got a false conclusion. So that's unsound. Okay. So in a lot of these sorts of arguments, soundness is very clear. So the majority of the examples we're about to look through, soundness is indisputable. Okay? So let's do it. Oh, and these will be followed by some examples where soundness is debatable, and that's often the case where legal and moral arguments are concerned. So we'll look at a couple of those as well, but let's get going. So, all human beings are mortal, and Socrates was a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal. Assuming these two are true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. That makes the argument valid. So then you got to move on to soundness. Is this true? Yes. Is this true? Yes. That makes this argument both valid and sound. All chickens work in libraries, and all librarians are chickens, therefore all librarians work in a library. Now, this is a good example because you got to get over that tendency we have to just want to throw this argument out because it sounds so silly, right? So just go with it. Okay, fine. All chickens work in libraries. I'll just go with it. Let's pretend it's true. And all librarians are chickens. Let's pretend that's true as well. Assuming those two or pretending those two are true for a minute, would that conclusion have to be true as well? Answer's yes. So this argument's valid. Logic's good. So that means you move on to soundness. Is it true that all chickens work in false? False. So although valid, this argument is unsound. Both premises are false. All humans are mortal, and the President of the United States is mortal. Hence, the President of the United States is human. This one is tricky. It's tricky in person. I bet it's going to be even more tricky online, right? But assume, okay, all humans are mortal, and the President of the United States is mortal. Does it follow necessarily from these two premises that the President of the United States is human? And the answer's no. This argument's invalid, hence unsound. Anytime you say invalid, you got to just tag onto it, hence unsound. Okay, so let me try to unpack this. If you were to say all humans belong in this class of things, this class of mortal things, fine. And then you say, well, the president belongs in that class too. That doesn't mean that you can conclude necessarily anything about these two things relative to one another. So this is a weird example because you've got a true premise, and a true conclusion, but the logic's bad. Okay? So I've got another example to help illustrate this right afterwards that follows the same form. But again, this argument is invalid because the conclusion doesn't follow necessarily, and that makes it unsound automatically because it's invalid. Okay, now look at this example. All raccoons are warm-blooded, and the Attorney General is warm-blooded, therefore the Attorney General is a raccoon. Okay, this is following the exact same form as the last argument about presidents and humans being mortal. Okay, all raccoons belong in the warm-blooded class, and the Attorney General belongs in the warm-blooded class. Does that mean you can deduce necessarily anything about the Attorney General and raccoons relative to one another? No, you can't. So the pattern's the same, but maybe this will allow you to see where that reasoning can lead you, right? So again, this argument's invalid because the conclusion does not follow necessarily from the premises, and it's unsound because it's invalid. Okay. A mile is shorter than an inch, and an inch is shorter than a centimeter, so it follows that a mile is shorter than a centimeter. Again, pretend these are true. I'm sorry that I keep repeating this, but it takes a while to get to fully get into the groove of these things. Just pretend that a mile is shorter than an inch, and then pretend that an inch is shorter than a centimeter. If those two were true, it would have to be the case that a mile was shorter than a centimeter, right? So this argument's valid. That means you have to fact check. Is this true? No. And and that's all you need is one false premise to make it unsound. But it turns out that's not true either, nor is this. So this argument is valid, but unsound. Either Donna Strickland or Taylor Swift won the Nobel Prize in Physics. Well, Taylor Swift didn't win it, so it must have been Donna Strickland. So pretending these two are true, would the conclusion follow necessarily? It's either one or the other, and it wasn't this one, so it must have been this one. Yes, so this argument's valid, which means you have to fact check, right? And if you don't know who Donna Strickland is, you got to look it up, and you got to look this is a real fact check here to determine soundness. So once you went ahead and looked it up, so you don't have to really know any factual information. You don't have to at all to figure out validity, right? It's either her or her. It wasn't her, so it must have been her. This argument's valid. But then that means you got to check soundness and look up Donna Strickland and look these things up, and what you find is that this argument's sound as well, because it's valid in the first instance, and it has all true premises, hence a true conclusion. So look at this one. Either Tom Cruise or Taylor Swift won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and it wasn't Taylor Swift, so it must have been Tom Cruise. Again, we've got valid reasoning here. Assuming these two are true, the conclusion would follow necessarily, right? So soundness is up in the air. Is it sound or not? You'd ask, is it true that either of these people won it? And the answer is no. There's your false premise. That's all you need. Valid, but unsound because P1's false. Operation Desert Storm occurred before Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Iraqi Freedom occurred after Operation Desert Shield, so it follows that Operation Desert Shield occurred before Operation Desert Storm. To figure out validity here, I recommend drawing like a timeline and just enter this information on the timeline as if you were following a recipe, right? Draw your timeline and go, okay, Desert Storm is here, Freedom is here. Freedom is already here because the second premise, so Shield is before it, right? I know that it's hard to really, you got to do this on your own, right? But the language gets can trip you up because there's a lot of repetition and you got the befores and afters. But if you were to plot this on a timeline and just look at it real quick, you'd see that the conclusion would not follow necessarily from the premises, right? You got one thing that's static here. Iraqi Freedom's there on the timeline. And then this says Desert Storm happened before it, and Freedom happened after Shield, which means simply that both Shield and Storm happened before Freedom. You can't draw any necessary conclusion about Shield and Storm from these two pieces of information. So this argument is invalid, hence unsound. If something's a mammal, then it's warm-blooded, and sheep are mammals, therefore sheep are warm-blooded. Assuming these two premises are true, the conclusion would follow necessarily. So this argument's valid. That means you fact check it. Is it true that if something is a mammal, then it's warm-blooded? Yep, that's true. And sheep are mammals. That's true as well. So you've got a valid and sound argument. If something is a mammal, then it's warm-blooded, and sheep are not warm-blooded. Therefore, sheep are not mammals. Assuming these two are true, that conclusion would have to follow necessarily, right? So this is essentially saying, if you got a mammal, you got something warm-blooded. And sheep aren't warm-blooded, so they can't be mammals, right? So valid reasoning, this argument is valid, assuming those premises are true. That means you fact check. Is it true that if something's a mammal, it's warm-blooded? Yes, that's true. Premise 2, sheep are not warm-blooded. Is that true? Nope, that's false. That's all you need is one false premise. This argument is valid but unsound. We're just playing with this a lot. If something's a mammal, then it's warm-blooded, and sheep are warm-blooded. Therefore, forget this one. That's a mess. All right. If it's raining outside, then the ground will be wet. Sorry about that, guys. I didn't realize that was a bum slide. Okay. If it's raining outside, then the ground will be wet. And as it turns out, the ground is wet. Does it follow necessarily it's because it's raining outside? So assuming it's true, right? When you got rain, you're going to get wet ground. Pretend that's true, and then pretend that the ground is wet. Does that entitle you to deduce necessarily that it's because of rain? No, think about it. It could be, the ground could be wet because of broken sprinklers or a broken fire hydrant, right? So that conclusion doesn't follow necessarily. So this argument's invalid, hence unsound. If smoking crack is illegal in the United States, then all chimpanzees are satellite technicians. And as it turns out, smoking crack is illegal in the United States. Therefore, all chimpanzees are satellite technicians. Assume it's true, just go with it, and then assume it's true. Assuming these two are true, that conclusion would have to be true as well. So you've got a valid argument here. The reasoning is valid. Then fact check. Is this a true statement? Boom. False. Valid but unsound. If you rob banks, then you're breaking the law. And as it turned out, you didn't rob any banks. Does it follow necessarily that you didn't break the law? No, because just because you didn't rob banks doesn't mean you didn't break the law in some other way, right? This argument is invalid, hence unsound. All published authors are writers, and some published authors are professors. Therefore, some writers are professors. Assuming these two are true, would that conclusion follow necessarily? Yes, it would. So this argument's valid. And then is this true? All published authors are writers? Yes. Some published authors are professors. That's true as well. Therefore, some writers are professors. That's true as well. This argument's valid and sound. How about this one? All published authors are writers, and some writers are professors. Therefore, some professors are published authors. Assuming these two are true, these get tricky, right? Assuming these two are true, that conclusion would not follow necessarily. It might be the case, but that's not what deductive validity is. Deductive validity is assuming these two are true. That would have to be the case. And it isn't. Invalid, hence unsound. Madrid is in Italy, and Italy is in Europe. Therefore, Madrid is in Europe. So pretend this is true. Pretend it's true. Would the conclusion follow necessarily? The answer is yes. So this argument is valid. So you got to fact check it. Is this true? Is Madrid in Italy? Nope. It's in Spain. So premise 1 is false. That gives you although valid, this argument's unsound. And then here's just a couple of examples where soundness can be debatable, which is fine, right? So in some cases, especially legal and moral ones, soundness isn't so cut and dried as the following examples should indicate. So in these cases, you may be required to create a sub-argument for the premise or premises in question, but we won't be doing that here at the moment. Okay, just wanted to give you a few of these examples. Multi-shot weapons should be banned. And handguns are multi-shot weapons, therefore handguns should be banned. Now, here's an example where, regardless of what you think about this, if you assume these two premises are absolutely true, that conclusion would necessarily follow, right? But wait, let me go back a second. But the question is, can you absolutely say multi-shot weapons should be banned? You can argue for this, right? But you can't say whether that's absolutely true or false. You'd have to create a sub-argument for that. I mean, this is indisputably true. So do you see what the point I'm trying to make? So here's an example where validity is no question. If those premises were true, the conclusion would follow necessarily. But soundness, you'd have to argue for premise 1. It's just not cut and dried like, where's Madrid? And does raining give you wet ground? You can't determine absolute truth for certain things, right? But we still argue this way. So this is going to be valid, but I don't know, soundness is in question. More argumentation is needed. Or, if the glove didn't fit, you must acquit. And the glove didn't fit, therefore you must acquit. No doubt that this argument is logically valid. Assuming the premises are true, the conclusion would necessarily follow, right? But then you can, as far as soundness is concerned, you can contest this. You can say, look, yeah, you gotta acquit if it's true that the glove didn't fit, and if the glove didn't fit, you must acquit. But I don't know, you can take issue with this, with whether or not this is true. Is it always true that if the glove didn't fit, you must acquit? Maybe the glove didn't fit for other reasons. So validity is not a question here. This is absolutely valid, but soundness is questionable. Okay, everybody. Sorry for the mistakes in a couple of those slides. I'm going to go back and fix that now. But what we covered is how to evaluate deductive arguments. Not simple, requires practice. And we covered validity and soundness. So I hope this helped to clear things up a little bit for you. Okay, everybody.